Okay, so welcome to this section of the interdependence course. Welcoming Klaudia Van Gool. Thank you so much for joining us. And Klaudia will be giving us an introduction to permaculture and also very kindly offering some video lessons. So if you're wanting to use some permaculture techniques in your projects, in your communities, then you will be able to access Klaudia's lessons, which will come later on in the course. Thank you very much. Thank you, Klaudia.
Thank you. Hi, so I'm going to start with saying a little bit about myself and my background. I'm originally from Holland and moved to the UK about 30 years ago, and have always had this interest in the environment, which play out in the fields out the back. But it wasn't until I had small children and I came across permaculture, and it just really made sense for me. So I continued to learn and started teaching, and now taught 30 odd courses, and it's just become a real way of life. And you'll see in this talk a little bit about how you can apply permaculture to all areas of life. So I'll say a little bit about what it is, where it comes from, and then I'll guide you through getting a little bit of experience about those sources, and then take you through some of the key principles through examples, so showing you lots of applications. But a little bit about the background. So a definition, there's many definitions, but a definition is that it's an ethical design system drawing on ecological principles in an attempt to create more human, sustainable human systems, meeting our needs. So in bold you'll see these three things that form the three legs of permaculture. It's ethical, it's a design system, and it's based on ecology. But another definition that I really like is revolution disguised as gardening. And that can be really true. So I find this to be true when I've taught in the Middle East and Palestine in particular, where teaching people fundamental skills of providing for their own needs, basic needs, creates an independence from oppression that can be really powerful. The word can be a little bit confusing, so just to explain where this word has come from or what it's made up of, and I'll say the origins in a moment. So permaculture, when you separate it out, comes originally from permanent agriculture. So finding ways of having food systems that have more permanence, rather than sowing a crop, ripping it all out, changing all the soil around and starting all over again, having more permanent cover crops. And then on the back of that, it's not just about land and how we grow food, it's also about how we interact as human beings. So it's also about a permanent culture. And a word that has come into that, we talked a lot about sustainable, about meeting needs of future generations and maintaining things. The word that's really strongly associated with permaculture is regenerative. So rebuilding, creating conditions that are conducive to life. And that involves repairing as well, because there's quite a lot of damage. So regenerative agriculture, regenerative culture as well. And you could say that's an aim, really. So just a little bit of where that comes from, or where the whole permaculture thing comes from. There were, once upon a time in the 70s, there were two people, Bill Mollison, David Holmgren. So Bill Mollison was a professor in forest ecology, and David Holmgren was his PhD student. And so they were studying forest ecology and just noticing how abundant and diverse and how actually in a forest ecology overall life is increasing and thriving. And so taking this as their template from which to learn how things work that are working in a really good way. And a juxtaposition to that is a lot of the human systems which are based on monocultures. So they were comparing the forest ecology with how we do food production on this one plant only scale monoculture, just using the soil as simply a growing medium. And the same with forestry, and the same even with housing. It's all become very monotonous and lack of diversity, basically. So studying the principles that are at work in this living forest system, and then taking those principles, designing around that, and designing those systems that take us away from monocultures. So there's a systems thinking thing here. It's all about understanding the bigger picture and how things connect with each other. So it's about integration and creating good flow within different parts of a system through systems management, so having an understanding of how things interrelate. And actually, this picture here is the ultimate aim of a permaculture designer is to design the food dripping and the hammock there for you, ready to receive without actually having to do anything. So it's all about working with those natural systems, so that we have to do a minimum amount of work ourselves, working with the natural way that things provide a function within their particular habitat. So working with all of life's kingdoms, understanding the biology that works under the ground, the fungal mycelium, how that interacts with the plant life and insects, and this is actually mycelium, so integrating into roots and transmitting nutrients and information, etc. So working with an understanding of all those different life forms to create an ultimate functional and really efficient way of us achieving, meeting our needs. So originally we were talking about applying this to, say, food production, but actually the range of applications is really wide. So effectively you can apply permaculture to all areas. So we're talking physically to land in terms of agriculture, horticulture, but also woodland management, any way of managing the land, thinking about water and waste management as well, how we do energy production and conservation, and the whole housing architecture planning thing as well. So you've got a design here for an eco-village, so we can do whole village designs based on these ecological principles. And this is a picture of a barn raising, actually in Cornwall, trying to choose the materials that are appropriate and local, and working together to make a building that's going to be used for the wider community. So there's the physical side, and then there's also the social side. So equally these principles can be applied to our human systems. So in community development, how we organise ourselves in organisations, how we manage projects, personal development, economics even, and teaching and learning. So this is just showing you the range of examples of where and how we can apply this. So more examples to follow. Just wanted to say a little bit about, so I said there are three key legs, three cornerstones to permaculture. We talked a little bit about the ecology there, that it's a design system. This is the ethics. So the ethics of permaculture are relatively simple. There are only three. It's earth care, people care, fair shares. And they're quite generic. They're not too prescriptive, but they're a really good guide to help us steer our way to how the choices that we make within our project. So earth care is effectively about, when we do any projects within permaculture, to do it with care for the earth in mind and all its living beings and systems. Secondly, with people care, is to look after ourselves and those within our communities, to set up project systems, designs in a way that looks after people as well. And in a way, so permaculture has done a lot of this, many examples of practical gardens and land management, and it's now moving much more strongly into the people care section, knowing that we can do this already. What's holding us back is actually looking after our relations and our inner development. Where are we stopping ourselves from being able to achieve these projects? And then a fair shares is about setting limits, so only creating as much as we need, and any surplus that's generated, that is freely shared again. So this takes us away from the greedy consumerist lifestyle that has been quite dominant. So we've got those three ethics, and then there's this prime directive, which is effectively about taking responsibility. So in Bill Mollison's words, the only ethical decision is to take responsibility for our own existence and that of our children. And this really takes us back. So I've taken a couple of examples here of composting toilets. It's about directly taking responsibility for our shit in terms of that. Where does our waste go? But it's about taking responsibility for our lives. And part of our culture has very much been, well, they should do something about it, or they will sort it out. And this is about, okay, that might be true, but in the meantime, what can I do, and what's within my power? So permaculture is quite an empowering thing. It gives you enough information to get going. And so in that same sort of sphere, food not lawns, so this is about another Bill Mollison quote, that the greatest change we need to make is from consumption to production, even if on a small scale and in our own gardens. And even if we don't have gardens, in any sort of food production, and that can start with sprouts on your windowsill and a few salads. We all have access and enough space to start providing some healthy food for ourselves, and to start becoming part of the production chain of food. And even if you haven't got that space, then have some involvement in your local food production through community projects or veg boxes, that sort of thing. So it's a real turnaround. There's a lot we can do in a small scale. So all of that by way of introduction and background and the key blocks of it. I want to just take us back now for a few minutes to this woodland. And I'd like to invite you to have a deeper understanding of the ecological principles by actually visiting a woodland now through just a quick guided meditation, if you're willing, because we haven't got a woodland right here, so we'll just go there. So if you want to, and anyone watching this also, if you want to just take a comfortable seat for a moment, and if you want to close your eyes as well, and then start with just taking a couple of deep breaths, allowing your jaw to drop gently so you can relax. Really feeling the feet on the floor, and even imagining where your feet are touching the ground, the interaction with the earth below, and even imagining some roots growing downwards into the earth. Taking another deep breath and really feeling more solid now. And then in your mind's eye, taking yourself to a woodland, either of your imagination or one that you know well or that you've enjoyed once, and walking yourself into that forest, into that woodland, and just noticing the smells and the sounds, and then seeing around you all the different layers of vegetation, seeing things that are growing on the floor, and might be different mosses or different creeping plants, and there might be shrubs and trees around, and different sizes of trees, young ones, right to really old, big trees. And there might be plants that are growing right through the shrubs and the trees, climbing up. So seeing all those different levels of growth happening. And then in that and within that, all the different life forms. There'll be creepy crawlies within the soil and on the soil, and might be a few slugs and beetly things and caterpillars on the plants and into the trees and on the leaves and the birds, different types of birds, all different levels, and just becoming aware of some of the interactions between those plants and trees, the insects, the birds, and just seeing the widespread palette and diversity of life, and seeing some interactions that are really dependent and some that are mutually beneficial, and seeing how on a sunny day the trees are transpiring, bringing moisture back into the air and helping to create more rain and more water. And then as things drop and die, gently disintegrated back into the earth and creating even more nutrients and richness in the soil from which more plants can grow and more things can feed themselves. And so many cycles continuing, and young to medium to older growth, open clearings to dense forest. All those different habitats and different niches, different places where different animals and plants can thrive. So taking a final deep breath, having a last look around, and then bringing yourself back. And when you're ready, opening your eyes. And so what I've taken you through is hopefully an experiential way of experiencing and feeling some of those relationships that are going on and some of the ecological principles that Permaculture has modelled its learning on. So we're about working with nature, learning from life. So a lot of those ecological principles get applied in the design, and then we have some tools that help us with that, with the designing, to put things in a place that they relate in a good way and that they are placed in the most efficient position. And one of those is zoning, which is the idea that we put a key centre of activity within the centre of the design, if that works, and then identify zones that move further away from that centre of activity, and place, as we decide where we put things, that the things that need a lot of attention are closer and the things that don't need so much are a bit further away, and that always we will leave at the furthest edge, but also in other places, what we call Zone 5, which is wilderness. So making a design so efficient by really considering what goes well together and how things interrelate, that we can bring things closer together and increase actually the area of Zone 5 and wilderness, so that we need less of nature to use. So that's the idea of zoning, and I'll give you some examples. And the other idea here is about making use of the best situations in microclimates, so having a good awareness of the path of the sun, both in the winter, summer, or whichever part of the season. There'll be slightly different ways that the sun will travel, where the prevailing wind is, what the soil is like, any shapes of the land, any elevations, etc. And so finding the optimum place for the thing that you need to have a place for to thrive. So some examples of that. This is an example of a house where I lived, where I found some old slate stone, and the Zone 1 area was just outside the kitchen door. I was trying to persuade my teenage daughters at the time to get outside. And so this was a way to do it, making a seat that would be heated by the sun just 3 steps away from the back door, so that they would get out and actually enjoy the sunshine a bit. And then I made a bed next to it, which became full, so that once they would be there, that they could see some of the permaculture design in action. So trying to bring closer, make it simple, and also finding a place for a cob oven again, within zone 1, just as close as possible to the kitchen so that I wouldn't be carrying loads of food and plates up awkward places, and easy access. And the second, one of the principles, the ecological principles, is about using natural and biological resources. So where possible, keeping it simple, using resources that are renewable, that can regrow. So in this case, cob is subsoil and straw, and that's it, creating an oven. So no concrete, and some waste bricks from storage heaters. So another example of zoning, this is Pentiddy, actually next door to where I'm living now, and right in front of the main house. They've got actually integrated within the house this veranda and an open kitchen covered area, so keeping that zoning quite close to home, and then useful, productive gardens of all sorts of different edible and medicinal plants right there where it's easy picking straight from the kitchen. So having close what you need to have close. It's that zoning again. Also stacking is the principle of making things, using the different layers that I described in that forest. So growing things at different levels, having ground cover levels and higher plants, and then things climbing up in different ways, and then having tree cover there as well. And this is an aerial shot of this project, Pentiddy. And so the area here that looks really wooded now was just farmer's field, and you can see how that's now been built up. Lots of trees have been planted, and these are areas where the woodland is managed in a coppicing way. So it's in a renewable way, it's cropped, the woodland is cropped at different levels, and it regrows. There's a little bit of pasture for a bit of wildlife. And the community woodlands to integrate with the local village, and then some food growing right close to the house, and that here is the garden I just showed you, and also a natural pond, swimming pool.
Natural burial ground.
And the natural burial ground is part of their making a living, yeah. So that idea of zoning, of bringing close to what's close, I gave you an example of a house, but you can apply it also to other situations. So taking a city situation, this is an American example, trips to Oregon, but just what's close to you, walking distance, cycling, public transport. Not sure about the plane, but just and also in terms of social, so family within the house, local friends, right to extended family, etc. So as a tool for mapping where to put your attention and what to give energy. And another social one where the different zones have been identified as me, my home, garden, community, and the whole world. And so where to put, again, your attention, energy, and focus. There's different ways you can apply it. So I mentioned briefly just now stacking, so the idea of those different layers, and I took you through some of those in the meditation. So big trees, smaller trees, shrubs, green plants, rooted plants, ground covers, and climbers. Recognising those layers, we call stacking, and what it brings is diversity, which is another principle. So using all those layers that we see in a forest system and applying them consciously in our human planting system so that we can make use of all that vertical space. So imagine next to this a lawn where you just have that of green grass, and the diversity and productivity that you have in that fairly minimal. So an application of this idea is a forest garden, and that's been a really growing practical application. So here's an example of that. So you've got, for the tree, you've got an apple tree, various herbs and ground covers and things that support each other. So there might be really aromatic herbs that will help deter insects from the fruit, those sorts of relationships. So another example of a garden with stacking going on, both using the slope and also effectively using vertical space, making optimum use of the space. And this is the straw bale house Jim Carfray's up in the top of Totnes. So the other principle here, which we've mentioned before, is using natural and biological resources. This is a straw bale house, and with wooden cladding and lime render. So again, using the natural materials. And we talk also about stacking functions, so having more functions for each of the things that we choose to put into a design. So multiple functions for each of these elements, each part of a design. For example, in this case, having a mulberry tree that's within the chicken compound will provide functions of shade and forage and food, absorb the nutrients, give protection, build soil, and provide some entertainment for the chickens. And you could probably extend that list. So it's about when we make choices, to make choices of things that are going to do more than one thing in that design for us. So here's a couple of examples of plants that provide lots of those functions. So we've got bamboo here that can be harvested when it's got young shoots and be eaten as food, as well as the many other uses of bamboo, of support and even the big ones you can use as a building material, not so much in our climate. And other examples, Cornus cusa, it's a really beautiful plant that has fruits. Elaeagnus, it's a nitrogen fixer, it's a plant or a shrub that adds nutrients to the floor, to the ground as it grows to the soil, and also has fruits. And then an example of willow. Willow is a very multifunctional plant, and this is a picture actually of it used as a sculptural way on road verges, but it also creates a medicine. You can make baskets and many structures and use it as biofuel. So choosing things for our designs that will provide us with many functions. And Martin Crawford has become a world expert in forest gardening. He has a demonstration garden just outside Totnes. If you want to know more, he's a good source for that. So going to an example here of zone 2, so just that little bit further away from the house. This was in the house where I lived, where the fence blew over, and so I tried to apply my permaculture thinking to what would I replace that with, and I came up with hand harvesting chestnut poles, making some wires, and then taking local variety apple trees and training them as espaliers to become a living fence that would actually let more sun through, but also provide my neighbours with a crop. So it was a social benefit as well, and pretty. So that's what it looked like looking into her garden. Mentioned diversity before, so using and valuing diversity. So looking at, for example, in my life, some of the work that I do is quite varied, and actually that keeps me much happier. And it uses my different skills, and then I can cross-fertilise the different things. So I go right from industrial environmental consultancy to training and facilitation, and a bit of practical stuff as well. And another person in the UK who's become a really good example of this is Ben Law, who has been instigating that way of working with woodland, of coppicing, so managing woodland in a way that you cut different areas at different times, which creates lots of diversity, and then using the different products to create different size wood from which to do green woodworking. He built a whole his house in there, and then from learning that, then started applying round wood building, so less processing, using wood that's still in the round, is stronger. so closer to nature, less work in that way, and making buildings in that way. And on top of that, he trains apprentices and he writes and does consultancy, etc. So again, using that first basic skill of working with the woods and how to best work with them in a way that has the least impact and gets the maximum benefit, and then sharing those resources widely. So a diversity of activity, but all through that connection with managing woodland in a good way. And then diversity in terms of applying that to a small or large growing area. So here, small. So we're talking polycultures, having different plants together that each have different functions. So having something for tea and medicine, and also, as I said earlier, being an insect repellent, some food crops, ground covers, things that fix nitrogen from the air into the soil, providing food for the other plants, etc. So beneficial relationships, and moving on to a principle of cooperation and not competition. So in nature, actually, when you really look at it, most things relate in a way that benefits the whole and themselves through that. So there's less competition than you would think. And this example is of a barn that was made on a small holding, on a cooperative of smallholders. And through that cooperation, they made a communal processing barn. So it has a juicing room, a milk processing room, a meat processing room, a large attic for social events, storage underneath, and they built this together. And so when they come to processing, they can just use the room for the time that they need, and they don't each have to be building all of those processing capacities. So building resilience to having also, when you need something doing a function in a design, to make sure that that's met by different things, different elements. So for example here, that in terms of making sure there's enough water, that you set up your growing systems through rain gardens as a way to infiltrate as much water as you can, as well as catching some of the rainwater from the roofs, so that you have some stored and the soil is well covered. And then just how we manage the landscape is very much about diverting water away from us, whereas actually we could landscape our gardens so that we catch and store that rainwater rather than it causing flooding down the road. So rainwater harvesting is a really key part of how we manage water, making use of the roofs. This was a project that I did, and plumbed the rainwater straight into my toilet and saved lots of water. I want to say a little bit about soil also. So the principle of minimum effort, maximum output, that way that permaculture is always looking for that key thing to do that will make a big difference, is trying to get the maximum efficiency by really seeing where the biggest impact could be had. And then combine that with the principle of wild soil, so really understanding how soil operates in the wild, and then working, copying those sort of ideas. So in this case, making new raised beds by simply layering cardboard and various organic materials that will disintegrate like a compost heap in situ that you can grow and plant straight into. So creating deep, rich soil without having to do lots of digging.
Is that wool there on the top?
Pardon?
Is that wool there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was waste wool that still
Waste
had
wool,
bits
yeah.
of shit in it, so it really disintegrated quickly.
Yeah.
And this is a colleague of mine, teaching permaculture in a minimum effort, maximum output way. Because, as Jake said earlier, is when you teach, when people really learn, they learn for themselves, not by you just telling them something. And that's what I do. No good. Yeah, him trying to explain. They're much better learning for themselves. So part of that understanding how soil is in nature, then working with that in a way that we really look after the life and building soil in permaculture. So that regeneration in action, generally the soil level will increase. So having a really a good awareness of how that works and what that is, and appreciating it. And there is a bit of an issue with loss of soil at the moment, just through how we do agriculture. So conventional agriculture, ploughing, soil running away, and carbon being released, and regenerative agriculture, which works with plants to actually store more carbon into the soil. That's the way we want to go. An example of that here, restoration agriculture. This is actually in the States, so planting on contour, so that any rain that's caught is caught by the vegetation and doesn't take the soil away. Using the different layers, using animals to graze within that as well. And this has been shown to be much more productive than next doors, which is conventional monoculture farming. And of course, no use of pesticides and anything like that. So I've got just a 2-minute clip here from a guy called Ernst Gotsch, who applies this sort of thinking.
Agricultura sintropica, o conceito da sintropia pode ser o conceito da vida, ou seja, o modo de funcionar da própria vida. E a vida, desde 3 bilhões e meio, 4 bilhões de anos, desde sua existência, em todos os lugares onde há vida, ela cria um saldo energeticamente e um saldo em complexidade positivo. Com outras palavras, sem propósito, juntando, ela trabalha de formas simples, ganhando energia e transformando aquelas em formas complexas, que eu denominei de agricultura sintrópica. É uma agricultura que trabalha com esses princípios da vida, que trabalham com, seja uma agricultura baseada em princípios submetidos à própria vida, que todas as relações intra-específicas baseadas no amor incondicional e na cooperação, todas as espécies equipadas para comunicar com todos os outros, e todos eles, cada indivíduo, de cada geração, de todas as espécies aparecendo, cada uma delas para cumprir suas funções, movido pelo prazer interno, e todos eles formando um grande macro-organismo só. Então, essa não é uma receita de fazer agricultura num determinado lugar, é o modo de pensar fortemente filosófica e de princípios, e agindo de acordo com aqueles princípios, aplicando os princípios, a gente chega para essa agricultura sintrópica. E aí não importa onde seja, se seja no lugar úmido, se seja nos trópicos, se seja no subdeserto, ou seja no lugar árido, ou no semiditerrâneo, ou no clima frio, temperado, não importa, em todos os lugares os princípios são os mesmos.
So I just wanted to show that, he gives it a different name, but it's about that example of regeneration, of really looking at nature and using those principles and creating more life. And he's regenerating, so he started off with land that was degraded, rainforest, and that's what he's doing there. So coming back to a couple of biological resources examples, so I showed you earlier Ben Law's house, which It was all built from the local woodland and straw bales from nearby farmers and etc. The other example here is these little pots. So when we grow seedlings, in the West you can use something like toilet roll cores. But this is in Nepal example where they haven't got those. So they use rolled up leaves made into little cones as the initial pots for the seedlings, and then as they start to grow and the roots begin to come through, they can just be planted straight into the ground. And they're raised off the ground, so also the wind does root pruning as to keeping it contained. And things like using wool for insulation. Again, biological, renewable, the sheep are not harmed in the process. And then taking with that the principle of conserving and storing energy where we can. So I talked you through a variety of principles that are more practically based on observations from nature. There's a few principles also that are more attitudinal thinking tools that Bill Mollison came up with. I mentioned already the minimum effort, maximum output. So always try to find that smallest key to open the biggest door. Another one, and working with nature, not against it. This is another one that a problem is a solution, which is one of those key things within permaculture that is a mindset thing. It's trying to be solution focused and abundant thinking, seeing everything as a gift. So the classic statement that Bill came out with is, you haven't got a slug problem, you have a duck deficiency. So it's thinking in systems ways. It's like if there's too much of something, what is out of balance, so that I can put it back into some sort of way. And another way of seeing that is everything is a gift. So being able to see the gift and the learning in everything. So just as a moment activity, if you want to, and if you're watching this, then maybe you can pause for a moment, is think about something that might be tricky in your life, or something that is a bit not quite working, and then trying to turn that round. So how can I make this work, or how could this be of benefit of another part of what I'm trying to do here, or even if it feels like something is just can't quite see the benefit of it at all, then at least get the learning from it. And okay, and I get something to take forward. So just taking in that opportunity to see the other side of something and see how it supports us actually in life. But combined with working with nature, if you're looking at a new situation, and you have, for example, in a field, a really wet patch, then the traditional way here would be to get the diggers in to drain that, so that you can do with what you want to do. And the permaculture bait would be, great, I've got a wet patch, what would thrive there? And it's that sort of thinking. So very much solution focused. And another one of those thinking tools is about obtaining a yield. Yield is only limited by our imagination, is abundance thinking. It's what else am I getting, or what else could this thing do, thinking in those multiple functions. And in this example, it's a salad, but it's also a mandala and a creative piece for the maker. And it also it got photographed and entered into competition. And also, it's become a teaching tool because I use it in different ways of teaching these principles. So what was a salad has become many other things as well as a pleasure to watch. So it's that, seeing what other yields are present or obtainable. So this was in my house, and I am into my plants, but I just planted a few lavenders at one point, and then many years later, here I was gathering these baskets of lavender. It just felt so rich. And so I actually made a list of all the plants that I had, and I counted 67 herbs at one point, and that included the wild ones that already grew there, but also the ones that I've imported,
Mm.
etc. So it's, yeah, creating that diversity, but creating through that also that real sense of abundance, many yields. And then bringing in something like the ability to look and harvest some of the wild plants and seaweeds here as well. So again, obtaining a yield, but adding to diversity of food and minimum effort, because it's all there growing. You don't have to be spending months sowing and planting. So foraging as an addition. Another example here of dandelion roots, actually, which are a bit bitter, and people may find them a little bit too much. And what I did here is saute them with parsnips, which for me are a bit too sweet. I don't like them, but actually the two together just cancelled each other out really nicely, really quick to cook. So, yeah, what could be seen as a problem, a weed, actually could be a really valuable added food, very nutritious. A little bit about energy cycling and how there is no waste in nature. If you think of the leaf that falls off the tree that gets rotted down, or anything that dies actually decomposes and returns back into something else. So that principle of cycling things, that the food that we eat creates the waste food that goes back to the plants that create the food that we eat. So any outputs within the permaculture system, we want to link back to inputs, creating closed loops wherever possible. So within that idea, you can look at industry as well, and just mapping outputs and inputs, and looking here, for example, at a brewing process, and that some of the waste, the spent grains, etc., instead of going to landfill, could form substrate for mushrooms, and some of the wastewater could be fed to pigs, etc., and some of the biogas could become fuel for something else. And so trying to create as many loops between as many of the materials as possible. And so here, again, that's done in a slightly bigger scale with even more components. So we've got a farm, a chicken farm, the brewery, and then also the growing area, including worm composting, and composting in itself, etc. So, and then thinking about the outputs of the whole park and the inputs needed. So, trying to map these things in a way that you can get as many connections as possible. And so, at the waste end of things also, so this is Weston Cider, a huge cider factory in the Midlands. And it sits just there, and what you're seeing here is the wastewater treatment. So traditionally wastewater treatment is massive concrete tanks with lots of pumps and aeration going. This is a wetland ecosystem, and so it consists of many different swales with different things planted, ending in a pond, and the overflow of that pond coming here into the orchards where the apples grow, go back into the cider. So keeping that waste and returning it back into the product, raw ingredients. So finally, a little bit about the design and social applications. And so the idea of design being a key part of permaculture, it's a way of getting from A to B, basically. So here you are, where do you want to be, and how so the design process being the way you're going to get there. And to start to do any design, you need to start with where you are. So identifying the needs of the client, doing a survey of the land, knowing what resources are available and what the limits are, those sorts of things. And then taking all that information and taking it through to an analysis. So this is one that I did for a camp that I run, Wild Women. And first, the key thing is to identify the functions out of that first survey information. What is it I want this design to do? And identifying those, and then designing in or trying to find out the ways that you're going to meet those key functions. and then considering the ethics and which different principles you can then apply. So it's a sort of stepped process that then gets you to some sort of design, in this case a physical one and 3D trees, and then once you know what you're trying to achieve, then some sort of planning so that you know how you're going to get there. And as an example, so often it can be a physical garden, but here the design process has been applied to a learning pathway to actually, for an individual to decide how they're going to develop their own learning and within an integral life design. And how does that link to the business and their own garden, etc., etc., and community projects. Just briefly wanted to mention transition towns because that is built upon the principles of permaculture, where when it became clear that we were going to at some point run out of oil, it was thought that we could use this design process to design a gentle way to make a low carbon community. So again, starting with the design process of surveying where are we now, deciding where you want to go, what do we actually want, so what are the functions of this, how do we make it work, putting it all together and making it happen, and then also evaluating and tweaking as part of the design process. And this is an application within in the States called City Repair, where they took what we call crossroads, and they call intersections, and just went, well, this is where most people would bump into each other, so let's make that the places where we can really hang out. And they started painting the centre of these crossroads and making lots of little structures like tea houses and mobile libraries and even cat palaces and structures to give people to get a place to gather. So a real social benefit from those changes. And then finally, just mentioning Extinction Rebellion as a really growing new organisation that tries to address environmental problems, and a really strong strand within this movement is regenerative culture. Again, so really trying to design in the ways that we can do that people care, that designing the culture that we want to live in as part of how we hold the meetings in that way. So this is an organisational example of applying permaculture design. So to finish, to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. And I really hope that that what I've given you is some of the inspiration of how nature just does it so well, and if we can only just apply some of that to our human ways of doing things, things could go in a much better direction. Thank you.